All right, ready to dive deep.
Always.
This one's less Law and Order, more like that life, where the lines get blurry. The Amanda Knox case.
Oh, yeah. That one sticks with you.
I know everyone's heard of it, Foxy Knoxy, all that. But there's so much more to it than the headlines.
Exactly. Really gets you thinking about how public perception gets shaped. You've got this really captivating story, confusing evidence, and then the whole international legal system thing.
Right. Like 2007, Italy. Meredith Kercher, she's studying abroad, tragically murdered in her apartment. And boom, her roommate, Amanda Knox, and the boyfriend, Raffaele Sollecito, they become the suspects.
And the timeline's wild. It wasn't some open and shut case, not at all. Italian courts, whole different ballgame.
So rewind the clock with me here. Meredith's found November 1st, 2007. Days later, Amanda, Raffaele, and another guy, Rudy Guader, are all arrested.
And Amanda's in prison for almost 4 years before she even gets an appeal.
4 years. Just waiting. Okay, so it's messy. But then there's Rudy Guader. He's tried separately, much faster, found guilty. But his story changes, right?
Yeah, at first he's saying he wasn't involved, then he's blaming it on Knox and Sollecito.
So they're all tangled up in this. And then the DNA, it's everywhere in this case. But then again, not really.
Right. You'd think DNA would be the answer, but the prosecution's saying they found Meredith's DNA on a knife, thought to be the murder weapon. Amanda's on the handle. Then Sollecito's DNA on a bra clasp at the seam.
At first glance, that sounds, pretty bad, but there's going to be more to it, right?
Oh, yeah. Huge but. Independent experts later on were like, hold on. The way they handled this DNA was really iffy. Back then, the testing wasn't as good as it is now.
So are you saying they could have gotten it wrong?
It's possible. Think about it, even back then. A tiny amount of DNA could throw the whole thing off. It's not as simple as it sounds.
So we've got potentially unreliable DNA, 3 people with their own stories, and then the media gets involved. And we all know how that went, especially with how they portrayed Amanda's behavior after the murder. Foxy Knoxy didn't just appear out of thin air.
The media really had a field day with this one. Especially back then, it was a different world.
And even though there wasn't really evidence to support that whole narrative, was there?
Nope, not really. But that's the thing about a good story. Once it takes hold.
Okay, so let me get this straight. We've got potentially shaky DNA evidence, 3 people giving conflicting accounts, and the media's already decided Amanda's a femme fatale. Where do we even go from here?
This is where it gets really interesting, well, more like frustratingly complex. Remember Rudy Guader? Convicted separately, right?
Yeah, his DNA was a match, which wasn't the case for Amanda or Raffaele. So why didn't they just focus on him after that?
Well, they were really pushing this idea that all 3 of them were involved. This whole drug-fueled, sex game gone wrong thing.
Even with Guader already found guilty.
Yeah, it's like they had this story in their heads, and they weren't letting go.
Even if the pieces didn't fit.
Exactly. And remember, that whole Amanda Knox femme fatale idea, that had already stuck in everyone's minds.
And the media loved that angle, right? Well, what were they basing that on, really?
It's just it. There wasn't much concrete stuff. They talked about how she acted during questioning, saying she seemed off, maybe even playful sometimes.
Which, let's be real, could just be her way of coping, right?
Yeah, exactly. Put yourself in her shoes for a second. Young American woman, suddenly a suspect in a foreign country, I mean.
Talk about a nightmare.
And the media took those few instances and ran with it. Cold, calculating killer. And that just blew up everywhere.
It's easy to judge from the outside looking in, isn't it?
Totally.
And we can't forget, her story changed, and she even blamed her boss at the time, Patrick Lumumba, which turned out to be false.
Right, those inconsistencies definitely didn't help. But again, she's being questioned in a language she doesn't even speak fluently. I mean, anyone in that situation might get things mixed up, even if they're totally innocent.
It makes you think how much of what we saw was really her, and how much was the situation.
$1,000,000 question. But there's no denying how powerful that femme fatale story became. It was like a real-life movie plot, and no one wanted to let go.
So even with all this back and forth, Amanda and Raffaele were acquitted in the end, weren't they? Does that mean justice was served? So even with all this back and forth, Amanda and Raffaele were acquitted in the end, weren't they? Does that mean justice was served?
It's tough to say, really. Yeah, they were acquitted, no doubt, back in 2015. But after years of fighting, and what did it cost them?
Right. 4 years in prison for Amanda.
Their names were dragged through the mud globally. Even with the acquittal, that stuff sticks with you, especially with how the media painted the whole thing.
And what about Meredith's family? They've been through so much.
Exactly. They're still looking for answers. Even with Guader behind bars, they believe others were involved. It was a horrific tragedy, and they deserve justice for Meredith.
It really hits home how much this case impacted everyone involved.
No doubt. I mean, people were debating this internationally. The media's role, different legal systems, how we even decide who's guilty or innocent.
It's so easy to get caught up in the story, but we forget about the real people at the center of it.
Right? Look at Amanda Knox. She could just disappeared after everything.
Oh,
But she chose to speak out.
really?
Yeah, she's been pushing for changes in the justice system, talking about what she went through.
Wow. I didn't know that. That's kind of amazing.
Makes you think,
Uh,
how do you even move on after something like that? The power of perception, resilience, finding your voice again.
hmm. This whole thing has really made me think. Unreliable DNA, conflicting stories, the media frenzy. But knowing Guade was convicted, his DNA was there, he admitted to being there, could he have acted alone?
Yeah. $1 million question, right? No easy answers here. It's really up to each of us to look at everything and decide for ourselves.
Crazy. Well, there you have it. What do you think? If you were on that jury with all that pressure, what would you have decided? Let us know. Hit us up on social media. Let's keep this conversation going. And until next time, keep diving deep.